The testimony of Sarah.
I am Sarah, wife of Abraham. My story is one of waiting, doubt, and ultimately the fulfillment of God's impossible promise. My deepest desire was to hold a son in my arms. You see, for years I carried the weight of barrenness, an emptiness that only deepened as I grew older. In my times, a woman's worth was tied to her ability to bear children, to create a future for her family. I could not do that. I felt helpless and ashamed. God had promised my husband Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, and yet I remained childless. Decades went by, and each year I grew older, and the promise seemed farther away. I tried to accept that I would never be a mother, that perhaps I wasn't meant to be part of God's plan in the way Abraham was. But I wanted so much to fulfill that promise. So I did what many of us do when waiting becomes unbearable. I took matters into my own hands. I convinced Abraham to take my servant Hagar as a wife so that we might have a child through her. It seemed like the only solution. I thought, perhaps this is how God will give us a family. But when Hagar became pregnant, everything changed. She began to despise me, and I felt even more alone, even more ashamed. I treated her harshly, driven by my own pain and insecurity. Her son Ishmael was born, and while he was Abraham's child, I still wasn't a mother. I felt like I had tried everything, and yet my womb remained closed. I was growing old, far too old to bear children. The idea of me giving birth at nearly 90 was laughable. Then one day, 3 visitors came to our tent. Abraham rushed to welcome them, as was our custom. As I listened from the entrance, one of them, who I now know was the Lord himself, spoke directly to Abraham, saying that I would have a son by this time next year. I couldn't help it. I laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh, just one born out of years of disappointment. It seemed absurd. It was indeed impossible. But the Lord heard my laughter. He asked why I laughed and said, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" I insisted I had not laughed. But he said that I had indeed laughed. And then the impossible happened. I became pregnant. I could hardly explain what it felt like to feel life growing inside me after so many years of emptiness. It was as if God had breathed new life into my very soul. My laughter of doubt turned into laughter of joy. When my son Isaac was born, I held him in my arms, and the joy I felt was indescribable. God had done the impossible. He had fulfilled his promise in his time, not mine. And now here was my son, the heir God had promised. I named him Isaac, which means laughter, because God had brought laughter back into my life. But Isaac's birth wasn't just about me. God had a far bigger plan in mind. Isaac was the first step in the fulfillment of his covenant with Abraham, a promise that would stretch through generations, leading ultimately to the coming of the Messiah. In my waiting, my doubt, and even my impatience, God's plan had never faltered. I often think about how I doubted, how I tried to control things instead of waiting on God. But in the end, he remained faithful, even when my faith wavered. He took my barrenness, my years of longing, and turned them into joy. Through Isaac, God showed me that nothing, absolutely nothing, is too hard for him. Looking back, I see that God's timing is not like ours. I had spent years wondering why he was silent, why my prayers were not answered. But all along, he was preparing something far greater than I could have imagined. He wasn't just giving me a child. He was building a nation, fulfilling a promise that would bless all the families of the earth.
Sarah's life teaches us that God's promises don't depend on our faithfulness but on his. Even when we laugh, doubt, or feel too old or too late, he is still able. Are you willing to believe again?